Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many of us as we age, we begin to feel those weird little aches and pains and symptoms. Perhaps we're finding easy fatigue. We just don't have the energy to do the things that we feel that we need to do throughout the day. Maybe there's sometimes just this overwhelming feeling of just plain burnout. On the program today, we're going to be talking about something that you probably don't hear addressed too often, especially when you're listening to the radio or watching television or perhaps opening up that newspaper or magazine. And that is simply adrenal fatigue. On the program today, I'd like to welcome on the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Ms. Catherine R. Simpson. She's going to be talking with us about her book, How to Overcome Adrenal Fatigue. Catherine, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, this is an interesting little subject here just because this can be something that affects anybody.
This actually affects many of us. You're absolutely right.
Now, tell us about what the adrenal's role is in our lives.
The adrenals are two very important little glands that sit atop each kidney, and they are responsible for a term that most of us have heard, fight or flight response. Basically, that's a hardwired biological response left over from the days that we were being chased around by, predators and animals and whatnot. But what they do is they produce the hormones that allow our body to deal with any kind of stress and to live to fight another day. They make cortisol and adrenaline are the primary stress hormones.
Now, how did you get involved in the research of this book here?
Well, like so many of us that do health research, I came to it through my own health problems. I had serious adrenal fatigue that was actually diagnosed as multiple sclerosis. I had all kinds of inflammatory symptoms and conditions, and I had symptoms for probably 10, 15 years, getting worse and worse and worse, and had all the tests and had lesions in my brain and spinal column and elevated fluid in the spinal column as well, and all kinds of troubling symptoms, let's say, and finally diagnosed with MS, and it was a wake-up call. I think so many of us that just go along in our regular day getting more tired, as you suggest, getting symptoms of, adrenal fatigue but not knowing it, really don't do anything until we're forced to. And then when you're told that you have MS and you're looking at a wheelchair, you think, I don't want to go there. And so my research led me to get to the bottom of what was causing these problems and resolving them.
Interesting stuff. Now, tell us about what some of the, symptoms are when a person is beginning to feel adrenal fatigue.
Well, it's interesting. Before we get to fatigue, we are pumping out way too much cortisol. We get stuck in this overdrive, and our body is making cortisol on a chronic, perpetual basis. We start getting weight gain around the middle and the face. You go to any store, any market, and you see so many middle-aged women and men with the big round faces and the big round stomachs. That's the first sign of way too much cortisol. Then we start getting high blood pressure. We start getting insomnia, panic attacks, cognitive problems. In fact, depression has been proven now in many research papers to be a result of way too much cortisol for way too long. So we start seeing all these symptoms of too much cortisol, and then what happens, of course, is our adrenals wear out, and we go into adrenal fatigue, and that's when our body can't make enough cortisol, enough adrenaline to keep ourselves going. Then we see fatigue. Then we see low blood pressure, mood swings. We can't deal with any kind of stress. We find ourselves flying off the handle at very little things.
Fascinating stuff. Now, what about sexual dysfunction? Is this something that maybe isn't being addressed here, this adrenal fatigue, as a cause of something like this?
Absolutely. When our adrenals start having problems, whether it's too much cortisol or too little cortisol, our sexual function just goes by the wayside. We start seeing in early middle age, many women and men in their late 30s, early 40s now, earlier than in the past, start having libido problems, erectile dysfunction, all the kinds of things that we see as a very common thing these days are indeed caused and resolved if you can bring your adrenal function back.
You think about that because you see so much today, with commercials, and especially, it's aimed toward men a lot of times. I'm not dismissing women by any means, but you see it a lot with men. And you start thinking to yourself, my goodness, this is inevitable. And it's the same language that you're seeing when it comes to cancer, for instance. That these are just things that were inevitable. Look, guys, this is what we're telling you. This is just the way it is. And for some reason, I'm just not buying it because, 20 years ago, that wasn't the language. This was something that, it's kind of on the verge. It might happen. It might not. It really depends on you and the choices that you make. Tell us about what's going on here.
You're absolutely right. And one of the key things, and I think that plays a part in what we see in terms of libido for men and women, is that the body sees loss of sex hormones, that would be testosterone in men and estrogen in women, as a stressor, and starts pumping cortisol out to compensate, and the whole thing just starts spiraling down, because the lower the testosterone goes, the higher the cortisol goes. That's just a recipe for disaster. There is no sexual function at that point. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, in the environment is a lot of pressures, diet, chemicals in our environment, lifestyle, we don't sleep as much, those kinds of things, that are lowering not only our sex hormones, but then raising our cortisol levels. So it's a recipe for disaster, basically.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noticed that in your book that that this isn't something that's really a super complex issue. In fact, it's a lot simpler in many ways, and that we're in the driver's seat more often than we would like to believe that we are when it comes to being able to address not only the potential for adrenal fatigue, but how to prevent it and actually enhance adrenal function in the first place, even as we get older. And one of the things that I noticed that seems to be a big problem, but it's one of the deep underlying factors that we kind of ignore. We always tend to think, for instance, with sickness and ill health, that it's something, unusual or foreign out there, and that if we avoid that, then, everything should be fine. But really, with something like this, you address something real simple, such as diet.
You're absolutely right. I'm lucky. I'm not a doctor. I think that allowed me to apply common sense to my situation. So many times when we have medical training, or we have a doctor that we place our entire health in their hands, we really let go common sense sometimes. And what I did is I simply looked at my symptoms and I said, oh my gosh, they're all obviously indicative of inflammatory activity. What controls inflammation in the body? And it was shouting out at me the endocrine system, adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, and I just did blood tests of all those hormones, and sure enough, I had none. So, again, it is easy. I think what you said is very true. For me, it was easy. Unfortunately, it's not in our main medicine right now. When you go to the doctor, it's not something they look at. Mm-hmm. So you kind of have to take your health in your own hands. And you're right, you do have to look at diet and lifestyle issues. You have to look at, across the board, how you're living your life. And I can go into some of the diet recommendations if you'd like.
Well, I would, because, there's some key things that people need to come to understand, for instance, about our food. As Americans, we consume probably more processed food than any other society, on the planet. Sugar, I think we're right behind Great Britain or England when it comes to that. These are some big, hardcore key things that are right within our hands to change.
They absolutely are. Sugar is an obvious one. Sugar suppresses the immune system radically. So every time we take a spoonful of sugar, or we have sugar in our processed foods or desserts or whatever, we are absolutely affecting our adrenal glands. And if they're already tipping towards fatigue, that's kind of sometimes the nail in the coffin. So obvious is stay away from that sugar. Try if you have to have sugar in your diet, fructose, more sugars that your body can deal with more easily. The other thing is that blood sugar and insulin are very involved in cortisol levels. As cortisol levels go up, so do blood sugar and insulin. So any diet has to be focused on controlling glucose and insulin, because we're seeing so much diabetes, so much insulin resistance. All these things are simply signs of high cortisol. So when you eat, again, you don't eat processed foods, you don't eat refined carbohydrates, you eat brown rice, not white rice. those kinds of things that we've been hearing for years, but when you understand what physiological effects they're having on your body, it makes it easier to do that.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's fascinating because I'm sure that the listeners out there are thinking to themselves, well, I don't eat processed food. You're talking about something you pull off a box or it's in a package. No, it's actually a lot more than that. We're talking about the meats that you buy, the vegetables that you buy, the fruits that you buy. I came across, to me, it was an intriguing documentary because there was no narration, there were no subtitles, there was none of that. It was simply titled Our Daily Bread, and it was about food production.
Those are frightening, aren't they?
It was frightening, but in such an intriguing way. I mean, you just find yourself fascinated, but at the same time, it scares the living daylights out of you, like, I didn't know that this is how this is about industrial manufacturing of food. And when you take a look at that, you have to say to yourself, geez, that just seems so unnatural. You know, no wonder we're coming across these problems. And it's funny because you'll have people that'll kind of blame, you know, the big industrial complex for producing food, but at the same time, you're actually saying, well, you know, I buy into what you're doing because I want it cheap and fast.
You're making, you know, such an important point. It's hard because one of the basic issues is our meat production. We know now that farmed foods, you know, the cows, the cattle that are raised in huge pens and so forth, have a very different complexion than the free-range meats.
Sure.
You know, you are what you eat. So free-range meats and dairy have a very different fatty acid profile. We've heard a lot about omega-6 fatty acids being very inflammatory. Well, now, because the animals that we eat are eating high omega-6 foods, they're becoming omega-6, you know, complex themselves. So we would be way better off if we could get access to free-range meats. Unfortunately, they're very expensive. So many, depending on what part of the country you're in, you may or may not have access to them. So I say, you know, educate yourself, learn all these things, and then do the best you can.
Yeah, you know, and it's funny, Catherine, you bring up something that's really interesting. People take a look at expense on the front end, but they don't realize how expensive it'll become on the back end if you go cheap on the front end.
Absolutely.
Interesting stuff. Now,
diabetes.
Well, yeah, you know, and there was something that intrigued me back as we began this show about 8 years ago, is that that was one of the questions. I said, you know, all of a sudden now you're looking at 1 in 3 people, and I'm sure that's even a number that might rise. I don't know. We hope that it doesn't, but, you know, right now it's at 1 in 3 people in the United States will have diabetes, at least type 2. And I finally had posed the question, and this is to several people, not only medical professionals, doctors, scientists, researchers. They've all basically said the same thing, and then I love documentaries. And they attributed it, the big rise to this, is due to corn syrup.
It's very true.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, we have moved to, high fructose corn syrup now. Unfortunately, they're changing the labeling, so we're going to have to be a little bit better detectives. They're
the fact that you have to read a label might be a problem right there alone. Right. But anyway.
Right, and I advocate, and I in my own home do not use processed foods. It's hard, and it's certainly more expensive. But when you start looking at the effect that something like high fructose corn syrup, which has, you know, there's been a 10% increase in gout over the decade of the 90s. I mean, it was amazing, and that is attributable almost exclusively, if you read the literature, to the increase in consumption of high fructose corn syrup. Very different effect on the body, causes the body to create a lot of uric acid, and you know, now we all know people that have gout. This was very uncommon. It's very painful, and it's not a good disease to have. So when you look at the effect that these things that we're consuming have on our body, you think, well, you know, maybe I'm just going to spend a little bit more and, you know, shop a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm. And here's another, living in Portland, Oregon, coffee is huge. I mean, we've got coffee stores on every half block, that seems like. You got to get your coffee on your way to get the coffee in the first place. Now, I myself, I used to drink coffee, and I loved coffee, but all of a sudden, just probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I just, decided I just don't want it anymore. This here is a big role here. This is something people use to jumpstart their days on average, and in some cases, it's a habit that is likened to smoking cigarettes. This probably plays a huge role, probably caffeine does, in adrenal fatigue.
Well, it does, because caffeine is something called a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, which means that it...
Try saying that 5 times fast.
What it does is it causes adrenaline production, and it causes adrenaline to stay high for longer. In other words, it doesn't get degraded, it doesn't get metabolized. So it keeps high levels of adrenaline circulating around in your body. That is it's a very bad thing. That's not a good stress hormone to have on a chronic basis. It causes, horrible conditions, catabolism, muscle loss and whatnot. I think, I have a very hard time saying never drink caffeine.
Right.
Never drink coffee. I think I personally don't drink coffee either. I gave it up. It was a tough thing to do, but unfortunately I have way too much information about it. But anything that's a stimulant is basically goosing those adrenals. And when we start getting adrenal function loss, that's the last thing we want to do. So restricting to the degree that we can any kind of stimulant is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is something that for the listeners, I'm not trying to, advocate, avoid these things. Some of you out there, just like me, I love the smell, the taste of coffee. It got to a point I was down to maybe a cup or two a day, but just one day I decided I didn't want it anymore. But, hey, if you like that, go for it. I think the problem, especially in America, is that we tend to emphasize the fact of too much. And one of the things is we were touching on a little bit earlier about, diet is, okay, sure, you like your sugar, that's fine, just moderate amounts. We always talk about moderation. But we're in a country, too, and I remember addressing this years ago with a dietitian. He says, the biggest problem with obesity in America isn't just the processed food, but it's the portions we eat. Now, myself, I used to work in the restaurant industry, and it depending on which type of restaurant you worked in, it could have been a 1-star or a 4-star restaurant. Generally, the cheaper the food was, the more concerned people were about, will this be enough to eat? Will I feel full? Versus, when you're spending a little more money, it was more like, so is this going to taste good?
Well, and you make a very good point. It's what you're eating, and if you don't eat high-fiber foods, which are the more natural foods, fruits and vegetables and whatnot, you're going to have to eat a whole lot more to feel full. Fiber gives you that full feeling. So if you're actually eating a more natural diet, you're going to be way ahead of the game. It's cleans your intestines out, causes, it has far few calories, than much more complex things like meat and so forth. So it is what you eat as well as, how much you eat.
And one of the things you talk about in your book that was really intriguing to me, I began to read a little bit about 4 years ago, was the role that DHEA plays. And I couldn't believe how diverse this was in our health. It almost seemed like one of them miracle things. Tell us about that.
Well, DHEA is another adrenal hormone, and it's an anabolic hormone. In other words, it causes muscle development, muscle retention, what we want when we're aging, quite frankly, when we all start losing weight.
When gravity starts working.
Right. It's very anti-inflammatory as well. It's one of the hormones that when I recommend doing a adrenal hormone panel that you always measure, because it will tell you also the how your adrenals are doing, as well as measuring cortisol. It is very anti-inflammatory, important in something like MS, something that I was completely deficient in. I don't think I had any DHEA at all. And replacing it certainly helped me regain a lot of muscle strength and kind of bounce back. And now at, 58, I'm, walking 4 miles a day and in better health than I ever was. Before I had those hormones in place, it was very hard to do those things, to walk. You don't have the strength, you don't have the muscle that you need. So it's a very important hormone.
Not to mention, you just don't have the right attitude as well.
Exactly. It's so important.
Catherine, a lot of people might take a look at this show and, okay, well, your adrenal fatigue, that begins to occur, later in life. But I say, no. How many of us this day and age have heard our teenagers and our children saying, I feel tired today. They don't feel like doing much of anything but sitting around and text messaging on their cell phones. That's a real concern because that's not natural.
No, I actually, one of the things I did to sort of change the world once I got access to this information was to found a clinic with a physician partner. We treated a huge number of middle-aged women and men for adrenal fatigue. They'd come in, they'd be tired. The first thing they'd say is, when they started feeling better, was, oh my gosh, I've got to get my kids in here. And it was amazing, almost overwhelming, how many of those kids, particularly if the parents had a thyroid insufficiency, because thyroid insufficiency and adrenal insufficiency go hand in hand, and we get those kids in there, and sure enough, they would have no adrenal function either. It's really, I think, a new thing that we're seeing.
Well, I think, too, is that you take a look at the American lifestyle, and I'm not saying, this could be happening in other countries around the world, but who knows, is that, when children go to school this day and age, a lot of them are going to school either without breakfast or with a processed, maybe high-sugar content type of a breakfast. You can see why they just don't really have much of an interest in school outside of the social dichotomy that's going on.
And they're not sleeping.
Well, that too.
They're up
24 hours of television a day? Geez, what choices.
and unfortunately, one of the huge promoters of cortisol production is insomnia, is not sleeping enough. So as we age,
wow.
Vicious cycle, we start sleeping less and less, and we think, oh, this is great, I don't need as much sleep as I used to. Well, that's completely wrong. What it means is as you're aging, after 50, the cortisol production at night is exponentially much higher. So what we're seeing is as people age, they're making more cortisol at night, and so they don't feel like they need as much sleep because they do have some energy. Unfortunately, it's very catabolic. In other words, it's breaking down all their tissues and muscles and everything else and having a very aging effect. And the same thing with our kids is they're not sleeping and they're producing cortisol and basically burning themselves out.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating for our listeners to know, we're talking here with Catherine Simpson. Her book is Overcoming Adrenal Fatigue. It's how to restore hormonal balance and feel renewed, energized, and stress-free. We've been talking a lot about some of the things that cause, as you call, higher cortisol levels that result in adrenal fatigue that come to things such as weakened bones, loss of muscle mass, irritability. I mean, it can go on and on and on, it seems like. Now let's begin to talk about some of the things that people can do. Obviously, taking a look more at a more wholesome diet, you're saying also sleep a lot more. The other thing, too, is, that you want to exercise. Just walking, could be good. I'm sure meditation probably is one of those good things in there as well. Talk about some other things that people can do, because these are some real basic things that are really within our control.
They are, and that you hit on the key ones right out of the chute. We have to exercise regularly. The exercise allows the body to chelate, in other words, to get rid of excess level of stress hormones. Mm-hmm. So even if you are going through a very tough time, we all have financial pressures and personal pressures and even rush hour traffic. But if we exercise regularly, we will get rid of those excess levels. We need to sleep enough. You're absolutely right. Excessive alcohol, smoking, and drug use, those are the three very key promoters of stress hormones. Strangely enough, there's a lot of studies out there showing that people that drink excessively have very, very high levels of cortisol, and they lose their cortisol levels altogether and go into adrenal fatigue. So those are all sort of basic. I mean, we know that we're not supposed to do that, but when then you realize what actual effect it's having on your body, hopefully you're going to make some good decisions.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes it feels pretty difficult to make those good decisions, because you get so tied up in habits. But just remember, that it takes time to build a habit. It isn't something that just happens right away. You just kind of replace that habit by moving in the right direction. Now, some of the things that you talk about here in your book that seem to be really big, especially when it comes to, I guess, call it organic choices in health, is the uses of herbs. Why don't you talk about a couple of key herbs people can start moving toward? Because I noticed here that a lot of these you can generally get, if you need to, in a pill form, but preferably you want to go more organically, like toward teas and so forth. But talk about some of these.
Right, right. Well, when you start making too much cortisol, it's very important that you address that quickly. And you can get those levels down almost immediately by using something called phosphatidylserine. And basically that is a substance that allows the cortisol, it just gets the cortisol out of your system. Another one that's a little more esoteric is ashwagandha. Most people have not heard of that. But that is another herb that is very, very effective in lowering those levels. And one that we've all heard of probably related to mental health is ginkgo biloba. That is something that has now been shown to also really lower those high cortisol levels effectively. So those are the three that are kind of more commonly used right now. Now, if you have low cortisol function and you need to raise those levels, ginseng is one that has been used for, how many thousands of years. Also, licorice. Now, that's not the licorice you get in the candy store. That's a licorice that you would get. It's the actual extract. We don't want to compound the problem. And basically,
we don't want to go get the red vines,
right.
folks.
I didn't even want to say that because I didn't want to put that in anybody's mind. But it's what's called an adaptogen, and basically that will raise cortisol levels if they're low, and sometimes lower them if they're high. But it has more of effect when they're too low. And that's a wonderful supplement that you can take. You got to be careful with it. All these things you have to be careful. I also always recommend very strongly that you work with a doctor that understands these issues, and then you can measure cortisol levels as you implement these different changes. So you can see, am I raising it too high? Am I lowering it too low? That's very important to have appropriate balance.
Now, Catherine, you mentioned talking to your doctor. Now, sometimes, and I don't mean to be an alarmist, I really honestly don't, but that may not be such a good thing because you hear about, they have honest intentions, but then maybe they really don't when it comes to giving out prescriptions for something like this. I haven't seen too much in advertising that really addresses adrenal fatigue and here's the pill. It's usually other things, but unless I'm missing that commercial. But there is that possibility, and I know that you talk about medication and adrenal fatigue in here.
Mm-hmm.
What should we be aware of if we go to our doctor, and that seems to be a direction they want to move in when it comes to prescriptions?
Well, this is indeed a problem. Because
and I'm addressing this the right way because I'm not saying, hey, the doctor's the bad guy. I'm just saying, if that seems to be the direction they want to go in.
Well, this is what I had to do. And what I've, encouraged so many people I work with do a lot of pro bono work in different parts of the country where I don't have doctors to refer to. You have to find a doctor that understands adrenal fatigue, adrenal issues. Your GP is most likely not going to understand this. When I started on this path 15 years ago, nobody knew what the heck I was talking about. So, you have to find a doctor that, one, understands that you have to test cortisol levels by salivary testing. In other words, you just get a saliva test and you chew on these little cotton balls 4 times a day to see how your cortisol is produced, what the production pattern is. These are fairly standard things if you understand adrenal issues. Most doctors will try to do a blood test. That is moderately interesting, but it's only going to tell you one point in time, and it's going to be a total level as opposed to free, which means how much of that cortisol is available to your body to actually use and not bound by carrier proteins. Okay, so there's a couple basic questions, and I put them in the book because you have to get on the phone and ask these questions. You call the doctor's office, you say, how do you test for cortisol? If they say, we don't know what cortisol is, or we do a blood test, then you know that you're going to the wrong place. And you have to find, as you go through this process, it's so much easier to have a doctor that knows what they're doing. So I say you're probably going to have to find a new doctor, maybe just for this issue, and to work with you to evaluate your adrenal status.
It seems funny that we'll actually take our cars to the right mechanic and get second opinions, but when it comes to us, we'll kind of take it on faith.
Yeah, you're not going to take your Mercedes to the Ford dealer. It's a strange phenomenon in this country, and it's not a terribly expensive process. So oftentimes these specialists do not take insurance. So what you have to do is look at, what is that going to cost me? The first visit is $350 or whatever, and you look at, okay, this is going to be a $900 process. Is it worth it? My guess is if you have, worsening symptoms, it is.
Well, exactly as I referred to earlier in the program, people look at the front-end cost, but they don't realize what the back-end cost is. It's always going to be larger if you go cheaper in the beginning, it seems.
Well, it's osteoporosis, it's diabetes. All these conditions, heart disease, are reflective of adrenal dysfunction. So, yeah, I'm with you. It's a lot cheaper to do the preventative. And I'm not meaning to say you cannot find a doctor that's within your network, your insurance network, and have it covered. You absolutely may be able to. Depends on the part of the country you're in. Mm-hmm. You're on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast, you're in Oregon, it's much more likely.
Mm. Now, Catherine, if you can, give out a website. People can find out more about this.
It's www.hormoneresource.com.
Overcoming Adrenal Fatigue is the book. It's how to restore hormonal balance and feel renewed, energized, and stress-free. Our guest today, Catherine Simpson. Catherine, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
We also encourage you, the listeners out there, be sure to join us at our website. We'll post this up there so you've got a hot link to be able to use to find out more about it at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.